much for your work on these important issues.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lynch. And let me begin where you ended to say that what we're proposing really is to clarify. The argument could be made, I think, that the law now requires this kind of licensing, but I think you would agree with me that the costs of enforcing those rights through litigation, the financial costs, the delay, the cost in time, make it often a impractical or less effective remedy than is needed and deserved. Is that the thrust of your testimony?
Yes, Senator. If the big AI companies had agreed with that position, we would be able to negotiate arrangements with them. Unfortunately, they do not agree with that. They do not agree that they should have to be paying for this. So they believe that it is covered under fair use, and hence the lawsuits that you've already seen starting.
In a blog post, I believe, from OpenAI, reported very recently, within the last 24 hours or so, the reference was made, in fact, to ongoing negotiations preceding the New York Times lawsuit, and possibly other negotiations are ongoing. But in the long term, those kinds of individual ad hoc agreements will be unavailing to the smaller newspapers or broadcast stations that don't have the resources of a New York Times, correct?
Certainly, that would be a major concern, is that the amount of time it would take to litigate, appeal, go back to the courts, appeal, maybe ultimately make it to the Supreme Court to settle. Between now and then, there'd be many, many companies, media companies, that would go out of business in that.
One of the core principles of the framework that Senator Hawley and I have proposed is record keeping and transparency. Developers ought to be required to disclose essential information about the training, data, and safety of AI models to users and other companies. Ms. Coffey, you make the point that this is important for newspapers. The AI companies have been intensely secretive about where they get their data, but we know, based on even the limited transparency that's available to us, that they use copyright material, and it's the bedrock for many of their models. For example, Meta and other companies use a database called Books3, which is a collection of nearly 200,000 pirated books. That's not public information, that's theft, in my view. I'm a former prosecutor, so I don't use that term lightly, but it seems to me that's the right term for it. So part of the problem is that AI companies are using this hard work, not just the sweat and tears and sometimes blood, but also the financial investment that is made to produce news. It doesn't appear magically. It's not out of thin air. It's an investment. And the kind of lack of transparency makes it harder for you to protect your rights. Is that correct?
That is correct, and we found the same thing with news media. 5 of the top 10 sites that are used by C4, which is the curated, more responsible data set that train the models of Common Crawl. We found that 5 of the top 10 were news media sites because it is quality, it is reliable, it is vetted and fact-based. And then we would agree that licensing would be the best marketplace solution so that we can avoid protracted litigation. And in order to do that, we need to know how they're using our content. So a searchable database would be something that we would recommend. There are other options and ways to do that, and I know that there's legislation that we're supportive of that would identify how our content is being used, because any sort of tagging that we do, any authentication, we work with Adobe and others, but it's stripped whenever they take our content, and it doesn't follow the content through to the output, so we don't know how our content is actually being used, and therefore we can't enforce, and it's difficult to negotiate if we don't have that information. There's different versions that might work, but we would be very supportive of that so that we can enforce our rights.
I would be very interested in more specifics from all the witnesses. We may not have time today to explore all the technical details, but obviously those details are important. I just want to emphasize the point that I think really all of you have made, which is there's great promise. There are tremendous potential benefits to using AI, for example, in investigative reporting, to go through court files or documents, discovery, depositions, all kinds of stuff that can be more effectively and efficiently explored and summarized by AI. But we also need to be mindful of the perils. We're going to have 5-minute rounds of questions, and I'll turn to the ranking member, Senator Hawley, now.